Today we will do the second lesson in a 4-week series from the Smyth and Helwys Formation series that really focuses on the various ministry partners of Paul. Last week we talked about Barnabas. This week we're going to be talking about Silas. Silas is introduced to us in the book of Acts. He shows up with Paul and Barnabas at the Jerusalem conference, which was a conference amongst Jewish leaders to deal with the question of whether or not Gentiles need to be circumcised. We know that Paul said of Silas that he possessed the gift of prophecy. Barnabas recommended that to Paul that they return to the churches that they had founded on the first missionary journey and revisit those churches. The problem was Barnabas wanted to take John Mark, and Paul didn't want John Mark to go because he had deserted them on the first missionary journey. So they agreed to split and go their separate ways, Barnabas taking John Mark and Paul choosing Silas as his companion. We know that as they traveled throughout and visited the different areas where the churches had been started, we know that on several occasions, Silas and Paul ran into hardships. In Philippi, for example, after healing a demon-possessed woman, they were thrown into jail. It turns out that this woman was the livelihood of an owner who was basically using her demon possession to basically market her as a fortune teller. So when Paul, exorcised this demon from her, that was the end of an income stream. And so as a result, they were arrested, thrown in jail, and beaten. We pick up in chapter 17 today after they have left Philippi and they move to Thessalonica. And the story beginning in chapter 17, and our focal verses are verses 1 through 13. When they get to Thessalonica, they do what Paul always does, which is they first go to the synagogue and they preach to the Jews. And they use the Jewish scripture to argue that Jesus is the Messiah and that everything that happened to Jesus fulfills scripture. And what they ran into was some of the Jews, it says, believed, and it also said a great many of the Greeks and some of the women. But the majority of the Jews didn't agree with that, and so they tried to incite the crowd and create an uproar and basically wanted to arrest Paul and Silas. They claimed that Paul and Silas were professing that there was a different king than the emperor. They claimed that Paul and Silas were talking about Jesus as being the king. And so that was a treasonous charge. Well, in the cover of darkness, the believers moved Paul and Silas to a town called Berea, not too far away. And there, once again, Paul does the same thing he always does. Goes to the synagogue, preaches to the Jews, shows them in the scripture why Jesus is the Messiah. And we read that they were much more receptive and that many believed, as well as some of the Greeks. So they had a different reception there, a much better reception. However, the Jews in Thessalonica got news of this, and so they moved to Berea to once again try to incite the crowd and create an uproar. So for you and I, as we think about this story and we think about our central question this week, which is, how can I stand firm despite opposition? We have a hard time relating to the type of opposition Paul and Silas experienced. Paul and Silas experienced being thrown in jail, being beaten, having to leave town, being run out of town by a mob. For you and I, that's not going to be our experience generally when we stand up for our faith. Well, we may suffer a little. Maybe people talk about us behind our backs. Maybe we get ignored because of our faith. But that's probably the extent to which we will face opposition, right? So what's in this story for us today as modern day believers? What are we to learn? Well, Judson Edwards, who writes the companion commentary for this lesson, says that, all of us will face opposition in our ministries. Whether we're Sunday school teachers, whether we serve on a committee, whether we're on church staff, whether we are people who are involved in some type of an outreach or mission type project, we likely, if we're really following Jesus, we likely will also experience times of opposition to our ministry. And so I think as we look at today's lesson, we can look at what Judson Edwards has to say, which is, there are both external as well as internal opposition that we'll face. When you think about external opposition, what comes to my mind is, people outside of the church. We normally think about our ministry as being within the church. So people outside of the church or forces outside of the church that oppose the work that the church is doing. This can be because they disagree with our doctrine, or it can be because somehow we have threatened them with our faith lifestyle. I recall one experience when I lived in Texas with a church that we belonged to that had a parking problem. It was a church inside town. It was landlocked. Parking was an issue. Members on Sunday morning parked on the street in front of neighbors' houses, and that created a real uproar. The neighbors, did not like that, and so there was opposition to the growth of that church. Eventually, the church bought some land, or some land was given to them, and they moved to an area where parking would no longer be a problem, and the church today still continues to flourish. But they faced opposition, and at some point, they just had to move. And that sounds kind of like what happened to Paul and Silas. Then Judson Edwards talks about internal conflicts that we might face, opposition from inside the church. If you've been a member of a church for any period of time, likely you have found times where there were opposing forces. I think about in my time here at Wake Forest Baptist Church, different events that weren't always unanimous, where people had opposing views, whether that be when we've had some staff conflicts, or even with our most recent change in Sunday morning programming to our dual Sunday school, dual worship. That is not necessarily something that was unanimously supported. And even today, there are some opposing forces. So there can also be internal opposition that we can face. Internal opposition can be from doctrinal issues. It can be styles of worship or music, disagreements, church staffing, budgetary issues. There are many different reasons. And often you'll go to a community and see many churches because, again, churches split and form new churches. And typically those churches will eventually split. So internal opposition is something that's very real. Now, Judson Edwards also makes the point when we look at today's lesson about, he uses the term a tale of two cities. On the one hand, we have Thessalonica, which was hostile. And then you have Berea, which is paradise. And that's kind of how it is in our missionary lives, in our ministry lives. There are times when we find ourselves in Thessalonica, opposed, difficult, challenged, and then there are those times in our ministry where we find ourselves in Berea. And we shouldn't be surprised. Even Jesus, in the book of Luke, had that experience where not a friendly welcome in his own hometown of Nazareth, but just down the road in Capernaum, he was welcomed and affirmed. So if we're going to follow Jesus, we too can expect that our ministries will face times of conflict and opposition, as well as times of peace and affirmation. Well, I thought a lot about this text this week, and I thought about, well, how does this all apply in a way that would be meaningful to our class? And as I thought about my class, and I thought, well, what's in this message for them? One of the things that I think is a message here, go back to Silas. I mean, that's what the lesson title is this week, Silas. And I thought, well, wait a minute, that's probably the answer. This is really about ministry partners and about how ministry is really designed to be a team sport, not an individual sport. And so I was reminded about some of the ministry partners that I have been able to enjoy times with over the years. Steve Shaw and I find ourselves continually kind of linked together in leadership roles throughout different things since I've been here at the church. And boy, I sure enjoy serving with Steve, because when things get really tough, Steve just somehow makes it easier. I don't know, maybe we just start talking about Carolina basketball and we just put things in perspective. But, I so appreciate the partnership I've had with Steve over the years. And then I think about, recent 10 years ago, I felt led to start a new adult Sunday school class, and I left a class where Kathy and I really enjoyed. We were with our peers, we were with our best friends. When we left, we asked Angie and Ashley Pierce to join us, and boy, it has been great. We've had great success with our new class over these past 10 years. Could not have done it without particularly Angie Pierce, who continues to be such an important force in helping hold together and grow our class in so many different ways. So I so appreciate her. I think about some of the staff members over the years that I've had the opportunity to partner with in ministry. So many, I almost hate to mention any in particular, but recently it seems like Joanne Stansel and I have really partnered on a number of different projects. And just recently we went and talked to a group of her peers, ministers, education ministers here in our area of the state. And we were sharing with them about our recent long-range planning, his vision, our mission. And it was so much fun to do that with her and to reminisce all the good times. Not just in times of opposition, but in the good times, it's great to have ministry partners. Of course, my number one all-time ministry partner is my wife, Kathy, who, without her, my 30 years as an adult Sunday school teacher, I can't imagine having ever been able to do it, because I need her support, her affirmation, and also her on occasion corrective wisdom that is an important part of any ministry. So listen, we're all going to face conflicts, sometimes in opposition, sometimes it's in our families, sometimes it's in our workplace, and yes, sometimes we'll face that in our ministries at church. In thinking about this and thinking about this lesson, my two takeaways are: number one, understand that ministry by its very nature, if it's to be effective, will sometimes work and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's going to be Thessalonica and sometimes it's going to be Berea. And just like Paul, who did the same thing in both places, often it has nothing to do with what we're doing wrong. Sometimes it just has to do with timing in the audience. It takes a lot of faith to follow your calling in ministry, to join God in the work that He's doing. But it doesn't come with a guarantee of success. If it did, it wouldn't be called faith. And I also think about sometimes, thinking about Paul, Paul had a lot of success. But if we read the scriptures, we might think that in Thessalonica he had no success, but that's not true. Success is not easy to measure using worldly terms when it comes to our ministry. We also need to understand that often success is there, but we just need time to see it develop. Looking back on it, Paul and Silas had a very, very successful ministry when we look at it 2,000 years into the future. But at the time, perhaps they didn't feel like it was successful. So we have to be very careful about that. And then the other takeaway is understand that partners in ministry are really important. Understand that ministry is a team sport. Understand that God puts people in our lives to be our partners, because there's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. And on both ends of the spectrum, we need ministry partners to share it with. Just as I've had the good fortune of having ministry partners, I know that many of you have as well. Well, I hope you'll join us again next week when we continue with our study of Paul's ministry partners. Until then, I hope you have a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you again next time.